Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Erin Burns, and I'm from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us today for the panel discussion on how do critical educators approach learning outcomes assessment. This discussion is being recorded and will be made available to PALA CRD members through the PALA website, but it will also be available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you only need a headset or speakers. We do encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right throughout the discussion, and Rebecca and Carolyn will attempt to include your questions as appropriate throughout the discussion, or we can do them at the end. We'll do our best to assist anybody with technical issues, so please feel free to post those in the chat box as well. Today's session is brought to you by PALA and the College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting Connect and Communicate and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, Sarah Pike, Amy Snyder, Amanda Avery, Ryan Sittler, and Ronalie Chiocco, and Diane Porterfield. I'd like to acknowledge PALA for allowing us to bring this discussion to you through Zoom. Thank you to Diane Porterfield for doing our closed captioning for today's session. We're also keeping track of attendance. So again, please type in the number of attendees at your location if more than one of you is watching. And I'd like to finally introduce our panelists for today. And Carolyn Caffrey Gardner is the Information Literacy Coordinator at California State University, Dominguez Hills. After completing her MLS from Indiana University, Bloomington, Gardner worked as an instruction librarian at University of Wisconsin-Superior and then at University Southern California, where she focused on the intersections of first-year writing programs and information literacy instruction. Her research interests include critical pedagogy and assessment, peer-to-peer scholarly resource sharing through social media, and information literacy collaborations in higher education. Rebecca Halpern is the undergraduate engagement team leader at the Claremont College's library, where she oversees first year's information literacy instruction program. Rebecca completed her MLIS from the University of Texas at Austin, and then moved on to instruction and reference librarian roles at Antioch University, Los Angeles, and University of Southern California. Since moving into supervisory positions, her research interests include anti-racist library management, critical pedagogy and assessment, and ethnographic research methods. So Carolyn and Rebecca, it's your turn now.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to say this just so then it's over. I'm really nervous, but thank you all for joining us today, even on your snow day, Deborah. And we're going to be talking to you about how do critical educators approach learning outcomes assessment. So you already know who we are, but we thought it would be helpful to tell you a little bit about our relationship to assessment. Rebecca, you want to start first?
Sure. So I recently moved into sort of a supervisory role that I sort of very formally oversee our first year instruction program and our research support reference program. And now that I moved sort of from a coordinator where I didn't have any direct reports to now a team leader where I do have direct reports, my need for assessment has sort of become bigger than my focus needs to sort of shift now towards more programmatic assessment. But I, like a lot of librarians I know, didn't really have any formal training in assessment in library school or even early on in my career. I kind of just considered assessment like a thing that happens sort of outside of my regular day-to-day work. I didn't really see a connection to its value or a connection to sort of the teaching and reference work that I saw as sort of my core responsibilities. And frankly, I was skeptical that assessment, as I understood it, was really going to teach me anything about student learning or help me be sort of better at my job. So I had sort of a disjointed and skeptical sort of understanding of assessment for most of my career, I would say. Once I came to the Claremont College's library, we have a director of institutional assessment here in the library. And it wasn't really until I started working with her and learning about her approach to assessment that I really started seeing it as a part of the work that I do. Assessment helps me understand why I do this work, who I'm accountable to, helps me understand what's working and what isn't working. So I kind of have a more holistic understanding of what assessment is, and that's going to be the context that I'm speaking from today.
Thanks. So I'm at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and I'm our information literacy coordinator. And like most information literacy coordinators, it means I coordinate our instructional programming, our learning outcomes, our one-shot instruction, and our assessment of information literacy learning outcomes. Like Rebecca, when I started as an instruction librarian, thought assessment was an add-on. I had kind of heard about it in library school, but not much. And I didn't really think much of it until I went to ACRL Immersion 2012, and it was awesome. And it sort of changed my view about how, particularly formative assessment in the classroom. I was really excited about it, helped me answer a lot of questions I had around my teaching and how students were learning in the moment. And then as I continued on in my career, the demands on me for assessment beyond just what was happening in my little tiny classroom space grew, and then I didn't like it. And so after that, I wanted to really merge the way that I taught in my classroom with some of the other institutional demands that were being asked of me to sort of both assess either teacher performance, student learning across time, not just within my one-shot sessions, as well as overall information literacy program effectiveness. So I sort of learned assessment has all these different pieces, and I kind of thought of it as one thing. And so what we're going to talk to you about today is, we're just two people. This is just our two ideas and sort of what we currently do. So we're going to take you through a little background on critical pedagogy, a little bit on assessment, our navigation of how those things work together, and then two practical examples of how we apply this in our work. Oops, I see Rebecca was supposed to do the slide. But she would note that this is very similar to our Library Instruction West presentation if you attended it in the summer. So if you did, and peace out, no hard feelings. And if you were there, this is the encore. You can find out what's going on with our assessment projects now.
So we wanted to do just a little bit more challenging in an online environment, but we were wanting to know sort of what your relationship to assessment is, whether that's your personal sort of relationship to assessment or your organizational relationship to assessment. So what I'd love for everyone to do is if you're in a room with other folks, take a minute or two to talk in the group that you're with about this. And if you're alone in your office, just like I am, open up the chat and chime in. So just take a minute to reflect, what is your relationship to assessment?
We should have totally had background music.
We can hum.
Oh my God. Background music not necessary. Thank you.
And Erin, I see in the chat, does that mean you're working on your relationship to assessment? That it's a work in progress? Because I think that is probably going to be the case for all of us here.
Yes, that is what I meant.
Yeah. That's definitely something that we hear. I know when we talk about assessment with our colleagues, something I've heard is sort of like, I know I need to do it, or like, I should do it. It's something I should do. It's happening now. Oh yeah, accreditors, thinking about like middle states accreditation, and so what programs you assess, what we do individually.
Yeah, so there's obviously going to be institutional mandates a lot of the time, which may or may not really resonate with what you're wanting to assess in your program. So we're going to be sort of talking about that tension. Collections assessment, right? There's a lot of other aspects of our work that we assess, not only our reference and instruction responsibilities.
Well, we won't belabor the point, but throughout this presentation, continue to kind of think about what your relationship is. And I think it's okay to have sort of an uneasy relationship. So I really like what Emily said, you know, small person program, it's about finding time. You know, also another solo program with Donna. And so sort of, oh, Deborah, I like complicated. That's a great description for, I think, a lot of the relationships we have with assessment.
Yeah.
And you'll see that that really kind of, a lot of what you're saying mirrors with our own journey. So Rebecca talked a lot about her assessment journey a little bit, and mine, as I mentioned, mirrors that. It was something that I needed to do. It was something I maybe didn't want to do, and it didn't feel immediate to what I wanted to know as an educator about what was happening in my classroom or what was happening in terms of student learning. But my view has changed a little bit, a lot. And a huge part of that was critical pedagogy.
So both Carolyn and I identify as critical pedagogues. That doesn't really mean a whole lot other than we're learning and reading and trying. And some of what we're going to be talking about does come from a chapter that we wrote about critical assessment in a book that I cannot, Critical Library Pedagogy Handbook, Volume 1. Sorry, I'm looking at it from my bookshelf. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today does come from that chapter. But if you want to go to the next slide, Carolyn.
Yep, I'm doing the slides. There we go.
There you go. So I'll give you a moment to read over this. This comes from the Critical Library Pedagogy Handbook that I just mentioned. And this is Nicole Pogowski and Kelly McElroy's definition of critical pedagogy that really resonates with Carolyn and I. And for me, the big takeaway for this definition is the focus on action. We assess in order to do things, whether that's to evaluate a program, to reflect on our teaching practices, to be able to gauge and I understand how students are learning in our classrooms, but we assess in order to. For me, that's really the critical piece of what critical pedagogy means for me and what how that relates to assessment. So it isn't critical assessment within sort of this critical pedagogy framework, to me, is not a goal in and of itself. It's a tool, it's a process to get us to be where we want to be.
And so there's a lot of theory out there around critical pedagogy. There's all kinds of other sub-theories, you know, feminist theory or critical race theory in education. And there's just so much you can read. And I thought it'd be really helpful to kind of explain what that means for me in my classroom. How do I take some of these theories and what does that mean for what my instruction looks like? And this is true for Rebecca as well. Generally for us, it means that we focus a lot on dialogue and discussion between student and instructors, really sort of continuing to think about Paulo Freire's banking ideology, which is where sort of the old sage on the stage method of instruction, you transmit and bank knowledge into students. We try not to do that. And understanding that students are co-constructing knowledge with us, we're learners in those spaces as well. They're bringing in valued experience and knowledge, and how can we use that and acknowledge that in the classroom? And in the one-shot environment in particular, this means doing no database demonstrations preferably, but sometimes a few, but significantly less than otherwise might be in a non-critical classroom, and spending more time interrogating overall information systems and doing critical thinking around, you know, information concepts like authority. We also think that a critical classroom acknowledges systems of information privilege. So in library instruction, this in particular might have to do with algorithmic bias or with open access materials. Did I miss anything there, Rebecca? Nope. Okie dokie. So when it comes to assessment, we didn't find there wasn't a ton out in the world about how critical educators actually assess what the work that they're doing. And a lot of the stuff around critical pedagogy focuses on empowering students, transformative experiences, but how do you know if you've done that? And assessment often has this sort of neoliberal impulse related to the corporatization of the university as well. So these things often exist in opposition to each other. So we started kind of digging into the literature on assessment to see what else was out there. And a lot of it is our more traditional assessment stuff, not a lot of critical pedagogy in here. So some of the things that we saw a lot of or rose to the top were the ACRL Value of Academic Libraries report, describing lots of different projects to sort of measure outcomes within the library and associate those outcomes with value. And a lot of the times that was with either student success statistics like retention or GPA, or collections and return on investment in terms of finances, things like that. And so that, as a huge ACRL initiative, I don't know about you guys, but I felt like I couldn't turn anywhere, any conversation around assessment during the years that was really active and not encounter the ACRL value projects. And then there's also a lot from the national conversation that influences the library literature. So our accreditors, I think somebody mentioned Middle States, we're a WASC. I'm in the West Coast, so we're WASC, but same thing. So much boogeyman type ideas out there about what our accreditors want, what our accreditors need, and what assessment means to them. On my campus in particular, there's a lot of drawing assessment ideas and methodologies from the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NALOA. And they have actually like a teaching toolkit, all kinds of stuff. And so they're very popular as well in the assessment literature. And then AALHE, I don't know how they say it, maybe Ali, the Association of Assessment of Learning in Higher Education. They do a conference and run a listserv, and a lot of the information there is really thinking about overall program or institution assessment of learning. So we saw a lot of that and not a lot of critical pedagogy and sort of how we do that work in the classroom. So thinking about what we knew about assessment and what we knew about critical pedagogy, we kind of wanted to generate a list from the literature of what critical assessment is for us. And so one of the first things for us was that it's has to be learner-centered, which values prior knowledge and experience from learners. And we got this specifically from Keesing and Stiles, and we have that article at the end. This person is in teacher education and really kind of focused on how having students maybe co-create outcomes with you, or having assessment that sort of acknowledges they learn, students learn beyond just the walls of your classroom, is one way to incorporate critical pedagogy in assessment. Some of the other things there, we think in reflection and reflective teaching is really important to be a critical educator. And M. Reel has a whole book on reflective teaching and mindful practice, which we list at the end. And so for us, critical assessment would have to include reflective components, either the students reflecting on their learning, us reflecting on our teaching, just like a lot of meta reflection. We also view assessment as an opportunity to interrogate power and ideologies. So what are the dominant messages that we are sending to our students about, for example, how to do research? And then most importantly to us is the results should be used in a way to improve student learning and teaching, not necessarily to prove our worth, not necessarily that those two things are mutually exclusive, but for us, we want the main goal to be improving student teaching and learning. That's what resonates for us as critical educators. And we found this quote from Maria Accardi from the Critical Library Instruction Theories and Methods book. She's got a chapter in there about critical assessment, one of the few we could find. And I really, really like this view, because even though we might have these grand ideals of what we want assessment to be, and or maybe what our political philosophy is. You know, it's all great and theoretical and perfect until you have to live in the world and do something. And so we really like this quote because it sort of advocates for living within that tension, creating disruption where you can, but that you don't have to be an idealistic purist. You can still move things forward. And, you know, we are governed by structures, and wherever we can interrupt or poke holes in them, we can go for it, but we don't have to not do anything because we can't do it perfectly. So now we have two examples for you of how exactly we do that.
Yeah. So, I should have done this earlier, and I'm sorry for not following my notes very well, but the Claremont College's library is something of a unique organization, because we are one library that serves 7 separate independent liberal arts colleges, private liberal arts colleges. So the colleges operate totally independently. They have their own admissions, they have their own tenure and promotion documents, they have their own curricula, they have their own assessment outcomes, learning outcomes, all of that. They all operate independently in that way, but are they have a number of consortial services and programs and even degrees and majors, and the library is located within that sort of consortial environment. So we're one library that serves 7 independent colleges with oversight from the sort of consortial entity called the Claremont Colleges Services. And basically what that means for us is that we don't have a strong institutional mandate for student learning assessment, because some colleges do and some colleges don't. So what this means for us is that we kind of need to create a culture of assessment that resonates for the library, given sort of our unique context and operations. So assessment, our culture of assessment really comes down to, what does assessment mean for us? Who are we assessing for? Since we are largely not assessing for an organizational or institutional mandate. And then how do we do that given those constraints? So for us, as I'm sort of developing, what does assessment mean? What does student learning assessment mean? What does information literacy assessment mean? It really comes down to identifying what purpose it serves for us. And again, I have to give credit to my colleague, Sarah Pickle, who was really instrumental in sort of getting me to think through these things. But the way that I have been sort of framing assessment within our instruction program is, first, it's about accountability. So what is our mission and who are we accountable to? We're accountable to our students, we're accountable to our community, and we're accountable to ourselves. So assessment is a way for us to ensure accountability to our mission and to the goals that we have. Assessment is also a way for us to be more transparent in our decision making. So we can actually point to various types of evidence and various types of evidence, even though I want to be clear that we don't only mean like quantifiable evidence. We take evidence in a lot of different ways, but assessment is a way for us to be transparent. It's a way for us to understand why we're making the decisions that we make, and what information we're using to make those decisions. And finally, assessment for us is about reflection. Again, if you think back to that critical assessment quote that I really like, is about action. Ultimately, assessment is going to help us do things better. It's an in order to. So I'm sort of framing discussions of assessment around reflection, accountability, and transparency. I also want to make it really clear what assessment is not. So this discussion will kind of reflect the tensions that I find in higher ed assessment literature, higher ed broadly, and also in library literature. So I don't want assessment to be a metric for return on investment. I don't want that to be the reason that we're assessing. I think there's a lot of ways that we can demonstrate our value. And I won't say too much more about that. I also want to make sure that my colleagues know that assessment is not surveillance. We're not counting up and seeing who's teaching what, and you're teaching 2 sessions fewer than I'm teaching, so there's gonna, so we're all like tallying and keeping track. That's not what we want assessment to be. We also don't want it to be a performance review or punitive. We want to make sure that assessment is sort of a culturally accepted practice to help us improve what we're doing, but in no way is intended to be punitive or a reflection to be used in your performance review. And also, at the time that I was sort of developing and establishing and creating a culture of assessment, I was not in charge of anybody, so that helped it to not feel so top down, like we're kind of all doing this and figuring this out together. So one of the ways that I have started sort of building a culture of assessment in our library is to be kind of stealth about it, and that means that I don't use the word assessment as much as I can, because assessment comes with a lot of baggage. I think people kind of have misunderstandings of what assessment means. We have what assessment means to administrators. We have what assessment means to us. Sometimes those are in tension and in conflict. So as much as possible, I try not to use the word assessment and instead use the words that reflect what it is we're actually doing. So I'll use words like accountability, teaching efficacy, making sure we have high impact pedagogy. So instead of using the word assessment, really focusing in on what it is we're assessing for and using that term instead. And I have noticed that just sort of makes buy-in a little bit easier. It helps us shift our focus differently, and it sort of helps release some of the baggage that we all kind of feel when we hear the word assessment. So some of the ways that we've started to build this culture of assessment in our library is, first we interrogated our documents. Sort of instead of, we do have learning outcomes, but they're framed within what we call habits of mind, which reflect the ACRL framework. So we spent about a semester really just looking at what we already have in place to be able to identify what our values are. So here are the learning outcomes that we've already established. Here are the habits of mind that we've already established. What sort of values have emerged from that? So we spent about a semester as an instruction unit, sort of just figuring out what our values are. What is it that we want to be held accountable to? We also have ongoing Skillshares to highlight active learning practices. And part of the responsibility of the person doing the Skillshare is to also talk about how it is that they assess those practices, really focusing more on formative teaching assessment. So we try to have Skillshares where we actually share things that didn't work as often as we share things that did work. And we talk about how we know that it didn't work and what we have made changes to make them more high impact, to be more effective teaching practices. So we're kind of building a community of practice where assessment is just built into that. It's a core way that we talk about what it is that we're doing in the classrooms. We also have microassessments and peer observations. So the peer observation program is fairly new, and it started with a grant that we got for renovating a classroom. We had to provide some assessment of our learning practices. So we developed a peer observation program to assess student assess student engagement. So that's been really highly effective. And again, being able to talk about what are our goals, what is it that we want to achieve in this class, and how will we know that we're achieving it, and just making our assessment practices highly local to our everyday work lives. And in terms of microassessments, we do sometimes send out surveys for student learning after a class. And we try to keep those super short to just 2 questions. What are sort of the 2 things that we're wanting to assess? And most of the time, those micro-assessments focus on some kind of affective aspects. So the current micro-assessments that we have going on now is a pre and post session survey that are 2 questions. They're the same 2 questions. And the first question is, how confident do you feel about doing research for your topic? And the second question is, we have one about confidence, and then how excited are you about your topic today? And what we're hoping to see is that people feel more excited after a session about their topic. But we're actually also kind of looking for people to feel less confident. And what I mean by that is, of course, we want people to walk out of our sessions feeling confident that they know what to do. But because we're critical educators, we're also hoping to complicate some of the research process through our sessions too. So it's not uncommon for us to actually see confidence decrease with some of the qualitative feedback that they didn't actually realize how complicated this process was. They didn't actually realize how much they didn't know. They are realizing now they can't just rely on Google or Google Scholar. So because we are wanting to complicate some of the systems and processes of research, we actually kind of like it when they feel a little bit more confused. And then finally, one of the ways that we're creating a culture is by creating a toolkit for our internal use for teaching librarians to share some of the formative in-class assessment strategies that we've been using. So what's next for us? Well, all of this work is ongoing, I should say, but one of the things that I'm hoping to do is to help my teaching colleagues have more productive consultations with faculty that don't only include sort of what we're going to be teaching in our library session, but on what are the goals for the session, how are we going to know that those goals are being met, and some of the assessment work that we're going to be doing within the session. So again, just really making it part and parcel of the normal sort of consultations and conversations we have with faculty when we're preparing a session. I would love to do a qualitative exploration of faculty's perceptions of their students' information literacy skills and needs. I think that could be a really interesting project for us to sort of learn how we can better align our teaching with what the faculty sees, since they get sort of a whole semester view of students that we don't get. And we're going to continue our peer observation program even after the grant mandate we have for that ends. It's been very positive. People have loved it. So we're definitely going to continue doing that, because that has been so critical in helping us understand how assessment can sort of be woven into our day-to-day work.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to talk about mine now. Like Rebecca, we had a lot of formative assessment practices already happening at my institution. So we have a shared lesson plan folder, and people are doing all kinds of cool stuff with LibWizard forms and Padlet and all kinds of things where students are interacting and they can see in real time what students are struggling with or getting really well. And so we definitely had that going. And we had a peer observation program, and we were getting student feedback at the end of sessions. And that was great for what we needed to improve our teaching practices in a lot of our one-shots. But we're at an institution that was undergoing accreditation, and there was a real push on our campus to have really all departments have some sort of summative assessment project that was done with preferably senior level, just about to graduate students, to measure learning across their degree program. And the library was not exempt from some of those pressures. And so we were kind of going to have to do something, but could we do something that would be really valuable for us and sort of align with some of our goals? And so the answer was yes. And I call it summative assessment with a soul. And what we ended up doing is talking with some of the departments we already had a close relationship with. For us, that was psychology. We ended up sort of reviewing some of their capstone papers, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looked like. So when the process started, just like Rebecca, we sort of went into it asking a lot of these questions about like, what do we want to know? We already have a lot of information about our students and how they learn. What is it that we really want to know? What information do we already have? And we had a lot of information about how students learn in our individual sessions. We had a lot of anecdotal ideas from interacting with students and research consultations, but we actually did not really know what students did back in their courses after the library session. No idea. So that was something we were very, very interested in learning more about. We also were interested in how we could better support students. We have a huge transfer student population, and there was just sort of a general sense of like, you know, we're missing some key support structures. And then we also did talk about our information literacy vision and those existing documents, like our learning outcomes, and how those could inform our assessment process. And it was really interesting because when we got together with the psychology department faculty and we're like, hey, okay, we each have to do this mandatory big assessment project. Let's work together. Like, what could we do? The initial ideas were psychology was like, hey, we can give you the student bibliographies. You can count how many good sources there are, and then we'll call it a day. And we definitely could have done that. It would have met the institutional mandate. But when we went back to our questions about what we wanted to know and what information we had, it wouldn't really answer any of those questions. And we felt that it wouldn't really match up with what some of the genuine questions we wanted to improve our teaching and student learning. So what we ended up doing is we had to do a lot more back and forth. It took a lot more time of chatting with the Psychology Assessment Committee and their department chair in particular. And we arrived at 3 learning outcomes that were from the information literacy learning outcomes the library had. They had some overlap with what was happening in the psychology department, and they were something we negotiated with the faculty as well. So we brought them in on this process about the kinds of things that we could look for and that they had been teaching the entire degree program their students about psychological research in particular. So we looked at giving credit to ideas, contributing to a scholarly conversation. In their senior capstone papers, they conduct a literature review and write a study proposal in a subdiscipline of psychology. So they are analyzing a gap in the literature and then saying how they're going to contribute to it with their study. And then in the process of that, they have to sort of track the existing online scholarly conversation. And if anybody's curious, we've got all of our outcomes at that link. So once we had that down, we kind of had to talk about how did we want to measure this? How did we want to see what students were doing? And we did have all the student papers. Initially, psychology wanted us to just have the bibliographies. And we sort of talked about with them and reminded them that just from the bibliographies, we wouldn't be able to find out all this information. We would really only know a little bit about giving credit and maybe tracking the scholarly conversation, but not to the extent that we wanted. And so we did end up with all of their papers. So all the library faculty at the time, the first semester, and 2 psychology faculty, we scored the student papers using a rubric we developed aligned with those outcomes of what would be highly developed and what was sort of beginning or emerging. And we normed that rubric through several meetings with the librarians. We brought it back to the faculty. Just, again, a lot of back and forth to make sure we all felt comfortable with it. Then we read all of the millions of papers, what felt like millions of papers, in small groups, and then we had a lot of meetings discussing the results. We've now done this for 4 semesters in a row, and it's been really, really interesting. There were some things that we did not do. So we were very explicit with the psychology faculty as well that we were not going to engage in conversations deprecating student knowledge. So we were not going to begin our meetings, which had the tendency to happen sometimes, working with our disciplinary partners about, you know, students can't do this. Ugh, I teach students this, but they just suck. So we weren't going to do that, and we weren't going to entertain those kinds of conversations in our findings. And the way that we kind of flip that around with, in particular, the psychology department chair we were working with is, let me think of an example. When it came to citation, students really struggled with in-text citation in particular. So we saw a lot of things cited in references that never had an in-text citation. some wonky in-text citations, and the department chair's interpretation of that was like, kids these days can't cite anything, even though I taught them it. And so we were like, you know, that's an interesting perspective on that, but look at all these great resources they're finding. You found so many great resources, student. How can we make sure it's clearer to your reader all the great things you found? So just shifting the language that we use with students and with the faculty. We didn't want to create a new measure or a new assignment. We wanted it to be authentic to what students were already doing, and we didn't want the perfect to get in the way of the good. So we decided not to seek out certain levels of reliability or validity in our measure because we were just going to be focusing on our teaching practices, not, for example, suggesting a new degree program or something like that, where we might need a higher level of evidence. And so what happened? Good things. We really strengthened, I think, the relationship between our faculty, the disciplinary faculty, and ourselves as educators. We've made some changes to the curriculum, both the psychology faculty doing it on their own, because that's a huge part of our vision is librarians do not hold all the cards. And we also changed the entire curriculum for our one-shots that we were doing with that program. We also had a lot of really interesting conversations and saw steady growth over time. And then this next semester, students are going to receive all the feedback from the rubrics going forward. They also had a lot of interesting conversations amongst themselves about like, hey, what do you do for this particular class? And we ended up with a report that we could put in our campus assessment learning management system to meet that institutional mandate. And it was something we still felt very proud of, and we learned a lot of information about it. And so just a sneak preview of what we actually did, and I can share this link in the chat, is we ended up making a toolkit for the instructors to help foster their own conversations. We have a lot of part-time instructors who rotate in and out, and they didn't really have sort of like a home base of how to teach this class. We also discovered through the assessment process that there wasn't a uniform assignment used across all the sections, even though there was kind of supposed to be. And so since there wasn't one, psychology was kind of working on one, and we sort of jumped in and used some transparent assignment design techniques from UNLV's TILT project to help design a template that we thought would resonate well with students and make explicit the goals that the faculty were looking for. Some of the assignments we saw beforehand were one sentence long and said, write a 20-page paper on neuropsychology. And that was it. And so, of course, students had trouble meeting some of these complex goals. We also created ancillary assignments for them to help scaffold, like an annotated bibliography. We talked about flow of the overall curriculum with our psychology faculty. And again, we changed the everything we were doing in the one shot. Thankfully, the assessment showed the psychology faculty and ourselves that all of the other stuff we were doing in our one shots to help students find scholarly sources stuck. We did not need to spend any more time at all finding anything. So the one shots have totally changed. There's no finding, there's no puppet, there's no psych info. It's wonderful. And instead we're focusing on analyzing an existing article, looking at how they use citation, looking at how they engage in a scholarly conversation, and doing a lot of small group work around that. And so what's next for us is, well, the institutional mandate is sort of ended for now. We've been reaccredited, so we're done. There is still sort of a push to kind of keep that assessment culture going. We learned so much from this project. We're kind of continuing to seek out campus partners. So we would like to do assessment of other kinds of student work at this capstone level, even for courses for which we haven't had a close one-shot relationship. Information literacy is an institutional learning outcome for my campus. And so part of our vision is that we're not the only people doing it, but we are experts in it, and we can help other departments sort of understand what's happening with their students, even if they're not actively using our services. We've been partnering with different disciplines as well, doing something similar with similar outcomes. So far, we've been working with biology for a few semesters, and then we're expanding our designing effective research assignment workshops for faculty as a result of this project. The last bullet about leveraging our dual roles on campus. For about 6 months, I was interim director of assessment for the whole campus. And you can bet your bottom dollar I just talked up this project as an example anytime I worked with a different program about how they could potentially assess student learning. The only outcome I ever used as an example was related to information literacy. And all of our faculty serve dual roles on campus. The librarians are all on these campus-wide committees. We're a smaller institution, only about 15,000 students. So there's a lot of opportunities to sort of leverage our dual roles. And at the same time, even though I've been describing this, what I think is a beautiful critical pedagogy in practice and assessment project, I still live in the world, unfortunately, and the provost and my institution is replicating one of those value studies and one of the ones I don't like. And but it's happening. That train is moving. I am already on it as the information literacy coordinator. And so a question, the definitions are problematic. They're scooping up all kinds of data, much in the way Rebecca mentioned about concerns about student privacy. There was also a really great book that came out recently about, I think it's critical inclusive assessment practice. And there's a little sentence about like when the provost asks, you can't just say no. So you got to kind of live out that Maria Accardi living within the tensions. So what can I do in this situation in particular, or what can we do? If anybody is from the CSU in this webinar, I'm kind of annoying on the meetings. That's one way. I ask a lot of questions, really make us think through why are we doing certain things that we're doing. So a lot of questions, and then also being transparent with the librarians I work with. Like, hey, I know this thing doesn't align with our values that we've talked about. And, it's not really going to inform our day-to-day teaching. So what can we get out of this project if it's not something we would seek out on our own? At the end of the day, I still got to submit that spreadsheet and do the project, but I'm trying to make the best of it and find those little pockets of resistance where I can. So being a critical educator or critical pedagogue doesn't mean I get to be an idealist all the time, unfortunately. And with that, we have all of our references. Some of these we didn't mention explicitly, like this Jankowski piece, but it's from that National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. It's really interesting. So all of these are there. Our slides are from Slide Carnival, and we would love to take your questions and chat more with you all about assessment. Chat away in the box.
So yeah, Erin, I'm not sure how you want to handle the Q&A, if people have their mics or if they just want to chat, however y'all normally do these things.
Mics can get messy.
Okay, no mics.
So preferably in the chat box, although if you have a really long question, go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to talk, just one at a time.
And I know we asked for questions. I think this is one of those rare presentations where I'm actually very curious in comments too. I would love to hear what you all are doing with assessment, and if you do practice critical pedagogy, how you bring that into your assessment self as well. For a while, I felt like I was living like two separate lives. I'd be like, okay, now I'm doing this, great workshop on racism in Google, and now I'm going to go over here and submit this horrible spreadsheet that violates all the privacy of my students. And so trying to sort of bring those two professional selves together.
And Carolyn and I are coming from like very different sort of histories of assessment within our institution. So Carolyn's institution is obviously like has sort of further along than we are, partly because we don't really have an organizational mandate. So if anyone has advice for either one of us, also super happy to hear that.
I see we have a question from Emily about the framework. I can take a stab at that. You may recognize, so I'll just go back, our outcomes are inspired and somewhat derived from some of the knowledge practices within the ACL framework, but they do not come exactly over, and they fit our institution. So in that way, we do use the framework a little bit in assessment at my institution, but we also have an institutional learning outcome, and that tends to guide us a little bit more. But that would be how I use the framework at the moment. Rebecca?
Yeah, very similar here. We have what we call habits of mind, which are sort of our institutional learning outcomes that are derived from the framework. And when we were doing some of those like value hunting within our professional documents, we used not only our local learning outcomes, but we used the framework too, and sort of put them in conversation.
Thanks for the question, Christine. Christine asks about the research assignment design workshops that I mentioned. We do partner with another unit on campus for these, 2 units. We partner with our, what is it called? Our Faculty Development Center, which is a sort of like center on teaching, to actually offer the workshop in their space, and they advertise it. And then we also work with our Writing Across the Curriculum coordinator, who also kind of does a similar workshop around designing effective writing assignments. So we partnered together and did one on designing effective research and writing assignments, and sort of merge things over together. And I'll click on our webpage. But on our webpage, we do have some information from those workshops. You know, we get about like 5 people each time, but I like to think they redo some of their assignments and then go back and maybe share with colleagues. And I think it would be an interesting assessment project to see what the faculty do after attending those workshops. Yeah, does that answer your question, Christine? If there's more you want about it. How we got started is our Faculty Development Center puts out a call to different departments like, hey, got any workshops? And so I always am like, yes, I have something. And they picked this one, thankfully.
Yeah, I do something similar. I work with the Center for Teaching and Learning, which is our sort of consortial faculty development organization. But I also work with the individual programs that do first year seminars that the library does our instruction pairing with. And they all have research assignments for those classes. So I will meet with the group of instructors that are teaching that semester, and do a sort of how to write an assignment so your students don't get really confused.
This is Erin, just a quick to jump in here. We do have an evaluation form, but you can also leave some kind words for our presenters today, and I can always forward those on. So if you guys could—
Talk about assessment.
Right? You guys could do the evaluation form, that would be awesome.
So Carolyn, you have another question.
Ooh, Donna is asking how we communicated to psych about not deprecating students during the assessment process. A lot of that was one-on-one conversation between myself and the assessment coordinator in psychology, who I view as like a library ally. And he was sort of letting me know about some of the politics and tensions within their department. And so then when I met with the whole group of psychology faculty, I sort of presented it as like, this is something the library values, and this is how we approach our work, and we hope you'll join us in that. And I'm not going to lie and say that like I think they jumped on board, but I think they toned down some of the complaining, and they weren't going to do it in front of us anymore, and they weren't going to ask us to include comments to that extent in our final report that went to the campus through our campus assessment system. It was also, I think, a really great conversation to have with the librarians. And while we were all kind of on the same page, being able to talk about it explicitly and openly was, I think, really powerful for us. And, you know, as librarians, you're often in a subservient role to regular faculty. And so it was kind of nice to get to tell them like, hey, this is how we're doing things. We're reading all the papers. We're writing that report for you. It's kind of our way or the highway a little bit. And so we did have a position of power that we wouldn't normally have because of this institutional mandate at the time. I hope that answers your question, Donna. But yeah, we started one-on-one, kind of like, hey, I don't know if you realize this, but when you say that, it makes me feel this way. Great. Any other questions or things people want to share about their own assessment work and your complicated relationships with assessment?
Like I said, I need advice. Any advice that you might have. Also, very well appreciated.
Here's my big question. I'm on pins and needles. I'm ready.
Ooh, I'm waiting.
Oh,
yeah. No, I don't really like doing the work of assessment either. It feels, well, one, I just find it to be kind of boring. Honestly, I would just rather be doing other things.
I like it.
There's a lot of parts of my job that I don't really enjoy, and that's normal and fine. So I hope you don't feel like you're being a bad librarian if you don't actually enjoy doing the work of assessment. What I do enjoy doing, and I guess, I don't know if you're looking for validation, but one, I validate you not really enjoying it. I don't either. But what are the aspects that I do enjoy is I want to learn how to be a better teacher. I want to learn how to help my colleagues be a better teacher. I do want to know what students are learning and what they're taking out of the session. So I kind of just try to focus as much as I can on that, on like the outcomes and not the actual work itself. Because I agree with you. It can be kind of, yeah. I don't, yeah.
I enjoy a good spreadsheet, a good report. So I actually do kind of like part of it. I realize that I am sometimes alone in that. But like Rebecca, there are definitely elements about it I don't love all the time. What I love is having conversations with faculty about how we can improve information literacy skills. And I always find those organic conversations really helpful. And so when I'm reading the 20th paper on, they were all about like neuropsychology and addiction, which got real old about 20 papers in. I try and, take a breath, but also think about like, okay, I'm going to be able to have some good conversations with faculty now that I've read all these papers afterwards. So kind of focusing on that end goal as well. Yeah. And, maybe there's a part of it that you do like, or maybe there's somebody on your team who is a spreadsheet nerd like myself. And so, maybe delegating different pieces of it. I know on my own instruction team, there are definitely people who love reading the papers, and there are people who love thinking about the one-shot session, and we can kind of break it up that way.
And also, like I said, just don't use that word if you don't like it. Like if it's just going to bring up, like if you get a tightness in your chest when you hear the word assessment, like just use a different word. Like that might really help a lot. I've noticed just a big shift in just not using assessment, but instead accountability, transparency, high impact pedagogy, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yes. And of course, it's always great when it's over. That's the part. So you can see here that we have our Twitter handles on the screen. Both Carolyn and I are pretty active Twitterers. So I would love for us to continue this conversation on Twitter if you're on Twitter. We also have our email addresses there. So if any of y'all would like to reach out with advice or questions or this conversation, both of us would be so thrilled to do that.
We didn't really talk much about the peer observation process, Deborah, but we can definitely send you the documents that we use. It sort of predates me being at CSVDH. It's kind of required by our tenure requirements, but I will definitely send you some of it. A key part for us is open-ended questions focused on how do we improve teaching and learning, and not so much those prescriptive questions about, is this person organized? Is this person, I don't know, engaging?
Yeah, we used the Center for Teaching and Learning here already had a peer observation program with like a lot of forms and like frameworks for us to use. So we definitely leveraged that. And also, just like Carolyn said, we meet beforehand to talk about what do you want me to provide feedback on, what do you want me to be observing, so that it can really be about improving our own teaching practices. So maybe I'm like, this is a brand new exercise, and so I don't really want you to be looking at like the exercise itself, but instead I would really like you to be looking at how well students are engaged or how my time management is going or something like that. And I will also find the form that we use that was developed by our Center for Teaching and Learning.
I found mine quickly, but I put it in the chat. So that's the sort of the overall form that our peer observers use. But also, like Rebecca said, there's a before meeting and there's an after meeting, and it's a conversation, and we try not to have it be punitive, but also to learn from each other. A big way we do that is we sort of mix up who sees who, and then we sort of let people kind of say, hey, I have this kind of class, I have this kind of activity. anybody want to watch. So there's a lot of informal observation that happens too.
This is Erin. It's 3 o'clock. I'm not sure if you can hear the train behind me.
I can't actually.
Okay, good. I'm glad my headphones work. If there's, are we ready to wrap up, or do you guys want to have like 1 or 2 more questions?
We can take one. I can take 1 or 2 more questions, but up to you all. Thank you for spending your time with us this morning, or I guess so afternoon.
Friday.
Yeah, it's Friday. It's before spring break over here, so getting a lot of thank yous. I'd like to remind everybody to please fill out the evaluation form.
And thank you all so much for coming and participating and just helping us think about assessment.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so as a reminder, this recording will be available to PALA members probably next week. We're also going to make sure that this is available on the CRD page blog. And if you're not a PALA member but are interested in becoming a member, please feel free to contact me, and I'll have the membership liaisons get back to you. I'll also invite you to contact me with suggestions for future discussions and presentations. Some of those are also on the evaluation form. And I would invite you to contact us if you'd like to present as well. So if anybody has something that they're working on, please feel free to let us know, and we will get that out to people. I'd like to thank Carolyn and Rebecca again, and everybody else who showed up today. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you all.